Every year, the town of Arroyo Bend turned its narrow main street into a river of color and sound. The Harvest Day Parade was the crown jewel of autumn. Floats built on old flatbeds, children in handcrafted costumes, marching bands, civic leaders waving from polished platforms, and throngs of townspeople lined three deep on the sidewalks. This year, anticipation hummed like a tuned instrument. Maria Delgado, the parade's coordinator and lifelong resident, had been up since dawn ensuring the schedule, the safety briefings, and the route signage were perfect. She knew every wrinkle in the plan and, more importantly, every crack in the pavement. The route crossed over the old Riverside Square, a shallow depression that had once been a marsh before engineers had filled it in decades earlier. The square had been accepted as stable, patched, repaved, and repatched so many times, the townsfolk joked it had more stories than the library. Carlos Menendez, a civil engineer temporarily consulting for the town on aging infrastructure, had been asked to give a ceremonial blessing to the parade route. He had seen the square before. His discipline made him listen to the ground the way a musician listens for off notes. A week earlier, a delivery truck driver had mentioned a funny wobble when crossing the square at night. Carlos, curious, had taken a measurement with his handheld ground-penetrating radar, borrowed from the university outreach program. The scan had shown subtle subsurface voids, arcuate shadows of erosion below a layer of apparently intact fill, but nothing that screamed imminent collapse. The ground had been consolidating under the weight for years, and the recommended further study was deferred because of budget grudges and the parade's fixed date. Still, he kept an eye on the data, overlaying it mentally with the recent unseasonal rain that had thinned a tributary of the underground spring feeding the old marsh. Water, having found old weaknesses, was slowly carving channels beneath the fill, softly dissolving clay and silt. That created a cavity expanding quietly, a hollow like a held breath. Farther out, beyond the town limits in the rolling grassland, known as the Wild Rim, the Black River herd grazed. These were feral horses, descendants of mustangs and thoroughbreds that had broken free generations ago, surviving on the borderlands of human expansion. They were a fixture of local lore, free, unpredictable, and strangely attuned to the land's moods. No fence contained them for long. The herd's stallion Keto had recently led a subgroup closer to Arroyo Bend, following the spring-fed grasses that had sprouted brighter after the latest rains. Their presence was tolerated, even admired, and sometimes children left apples at the edge of the pasture as a silent offering. On the eve before the parade, a small rehearsal for the marching band inadvertently pushed a stack of old festival pyrotechnics too close to the pasture's boundary. A misfired flare, its fuse damp but still smoldering, sent a sudden bright flare into the twilight. Horses whose hearing and perception were keen enough to detect the subtle changes in atmospheric pressure and smell of burning propellant flared. The Black River herd bolted. Keto led, nostrils flared, mane and tail streaming like dark banners. The stampede birthed a thunder across the grassland as hooves pummeled earth already soft with rain. Waves of vibration the town would never have noticed in isolation, but that would become the herald of something deeper. The thunder of the herd reached Arroyo Bend like a wild tide. Maria was in the staging area, making final checks when the distant rumble made her pause. It wasn't the normal clatter of trucks or the bass from the brass band's practice. It was a rolling, rising thunder coming from the direction of the Wild Rim. The townspeople used to occasional cattle drives initially smiled, assuming the herd was just grazing closer. Then the sound changed, sharper, frenetic, vibrating up through the pavement. Children pressed their faces against the barricades. Carlos, reviewing the final route with an assistant, felt a low tremor under his boots, one that did not match the parade's early traffic. Out beyond the last storefront, the stampede crashed into the lower approach of Riverside Square. Something about the horses' sudden weight, multiplied by their coordinated pounding, amplified more than ordinary vibration. Keto and his group, already in flight, transitioned from grassy slope to cobbled street with reckless momentum. Their hooves bit into the square together, light at first, then heavy, a focused cluster of impact right above the deepest part of the unseen cavity below. The cavity, already paper-thin from months of slow erosion, reacted. The concentrated pounding sat like a detonator on a thin ceiling. The fill above it flexed visibly, subtle bulges, hairline fissures spiderwebbing outward, dust lifting in miniature plumes. The wild horses, instinctive and uncomprehending of human danger, were doing what the town's engineers had debated for months in reports. They were stressing an unstable structure enough to let it announce itself. Then, without theatrics, the earth gave. A jagged circular rim opened, initially a hairline crack that widened in a trembling snap. The central section of the square pancaked inward, the surface collapsing with a dull, cavernous sucking sound. Dirt, cobbles, and a fountain's broken piping slid into the yawning maw of the sinkhole. A few hooves caught the edge. Keto, in mid-gallop, felt the sudden drop underfoot. He twisted, almost falling in, but his momentum carried him across the newly exposed rim. Others stalled, skidding, breathing hard. A mare's foreleg dipped into crumbling soil, and she leapt sideways with a startled snort. The herd, sensing a change in the ground, veered, their controlled chaos spilling outward and dragging loose debris with them. Dust hung in the air like a threshold. The stampede scattered into the side streets, the noise now mixed with human cries. Spectators, who had been waiting for the parade's first float, watched in confusion as the wild horses scattered near the parade route, and a hole, large enough to swallow a float, yawned where the crowd had been seconds before. Maria's heart dropped. Her training kicked in. She saw the sinkhole, and worse, saw the planned position of the main youth band float that would cross exactly over this spot in 5 minutes. She also saw a cluster of children who had been practicing a baton routine on the edge of the square, unaware. Carlos, arriving with his assistant after hearing the concussive thud, sprinted toward the void, the hairline fracture lines crackling faintly in the newly unsettled ground. The wild horses, their panic easing into skittish observation, gathered at the periphery, tails high, stamping the ground with nervous excitement. The hole, now fully formed, exposed a dark cavity below rim edges, softened with water-slicked clay. The herd's earlier pounding had ripped away the thin ceiling of what had been a slowly forming sinkhole, a hidden cavity whose roof had been reduced to a brittle skin. The stampede had bought seconds the town would have never had. Maria shouted into her megaphone, her voice cracking at first, but growing firm. "Clear the square! Parade reroute! Everyone back from the edge!" Chaos tends to split a moment between disaster and decisive action. The floats were lined up in their accustomed order. The band's drumline had already raised their sticks. The moment the hole opened, the noise and horses' frenzied movements snapped the organizers into motion. Maria's assistant, Aaron, ripped down the preset banner on the float about to enter the square, waving frantically at the drum major. The schoolchildren, startled, scattered backwards. A group of senior citizens who had taken their usual front row seats jumped aside. Carlos, panting and covered in dust from his sprint, reached the sinkhole's edge and peered in. He assessed the geometry with rapid gut calculations. Diameter roughly 12 feet, lip undercut by erosion, the cavity extending at least 6 feet deep, with loose, saturated soil at its base. The underground void had likely been formed where a buried culvert had collapsed long ago, its flow diverted, and the overlying fill settling as water, created a subterranean stream, undermining the compacted material from below. The stampede had pried open the last fragile layer. He turned and saw the first float, the one carrying the mayor and visiting dignitaries, still approaching in its slow procession. The standard parade route would have taken it directly over the unseen void. The combined weight of the float, the platform built heavy for decoration, and the expected people aboard would have exceeded the residual strength of the thin rim. A catastrophic collapse was imminent. It would have triggered a domino of falling platforms, panicked spectators, and structural failures, all at the most congested point. "Stop them now!" Carlos yelled, grabbing a traffic volunteer by the arm and pulling her back. He barked at the nearby marching band. "Halt! Hold position. Divert left. Now!" Maria seized the microphone and, with the calm authority she had cultivated over years, bellowed, "Parade is rerouted! Big float! Take Main Street bypass! Emergency lane! Right!" Her voice, amplified, cut the rehearsed cadence. The drumline faltered, then pivoted under the drum major's shouted commands. Volunteers erected temporary barriers, with the speed of people who have rehearsed emergency drills before. The mayor's float, already halfway into the square, ground to a halt. The dignitaries, confused, were guided off onto a narrow detour through side streets that had been unused for years. Carlos went to the sinkhole's edge with a borrowed orange safety cone, placing it precariously to mark the danger. Engineers and volunteers hooked a temporary rope line around the perimeter, while the fire department, notified by Aaron, arrived with foam barriers to secure the site. The wild horses, sensing the sudden human focus and calmed by distance, watched from the cracked curb, their stamping replaced by cautious sniffing. Quito lingered as if observing the new order and then drifted back toward the hills, the herd following in a slow, deliberate retreat. Later that day, when the immediate adrenaline had quieted, the town's stunt would become legend. How a parade almost ended in collapse, and how a wild stampede, misread initially as a nuisance, had pulled back the curtain on a hidden catastrophe. For now, though, the parade went on, diverted, truncated, and with an added stop where the mayor, standing beside a hastily installed barricade, publicly acknowledged the near miss. "Thanks to quick thinking and unusual luck," he said, choosing his words carefully, "we avoided what could have been a catastrophic ruin of our tradition." The sinkhole was not a mystery for long. Geotechnical consultants arrived by the next day, carrying compact drills, dye tests, and sonar probes. The initial scan confirmed what Carlos had suspected. The cavity had originated where an old stormwater culvert had been crushed and diverted beneath Riverside Square. Years of silt accumulation and accumulated runoff had hidden its failure. A subterranean stream had exploited the fractures, gradually enlarging the void. The thin cap of fill, stressed by unseasonal rains, had been on the verge of collapse. Without the stampede's localized loading, it likely would have given way hours later under the full weight of the parade's centerpiece and the packed crowd. The analysis made the near-miss concrete. It reframed coincidence into cause and effect. The wild horse's uncontrolled stampede had acted as an unintentional probe, concentrating dynamic loads exactly where the structure was weakest, revealing the danger before a calculated weight did it disastrously. The town moved quickly. Stabilization began with grouting the cavity, injecting a fast-setting cementitious slurry to fill voids, followed by controlled compaction of the upper fill. Engineers redesigned the parade route for future years, adding a geotechnical pre-check of key crossing points and installing early warning ground sensors beneath the squares most used for gatherings. Maria and Carlos sat together at a community meeting held in the town hall. The mayor, still a touch sheepish about making a public acknowledgement, officially added a new tradition to the Harvest Day Parade, the Wild Stampede moment. A brief, respectful nod in the opening remarks to the herd beyond the hills, complete with a small emblem of a horse's hoof on the parade's poster. A plaque was installed near Riverside Square's edge, in recognition of the wild warning. When the ground nearly gave way, a stampede revealed the peril. Prepared minds diverted disaster. Arroyo Bend, Autumn 2025. The Black River herd became a quiet local legend. Photographers who had once come to capture the horse's grace now also brought small jars of apples to leave at safe distances, not to domesticate, but to honor. Children drew horses with banners in their crayon parade drawings. Rangers placed discreet trail cameras, not to trap them in frames for social media, but to monitor their movement, noting from the footage that Quito's group had drifted near the square more often when the underground water table rose. That correlation led Carlos, later, to collaborate with ecologists. Wild herds sometimes reacted to subtle subsurface hydrological shifts, an unexpected natural early indicator for ground instability when combined with other data. The parade itself adapted. No longer was the route assumed safe because of tradition. Engineers now walked it with a geotechnical checklist. A small committee formed, including Maria, Carlos, a representative of the Black River herd's informal stewards, and the town's youth council. They kept the memory alive not by dramatizing the stampede as mystical, but by teaching that attention to irregularity and giving space for unplanned signals could save lives. The wild horses remained free. Keto's eyes, amber and restless, were seen one dusk on the distant ridge, as if watching the parade lights twinkle like a ripple of human celebration. Years later, children who grew up hearing the story would point at the plaque and ask their parents if the horses were real heroes. Parents would nod, answering, "They were loud enough to wake the ground. We just listened." Arroyo Bend's Harvest Day Parade still flowed down Main Street, but now with a pause, a brief one, where the route curved slightly, and the announcer, with a small smile, always included, "And we thank the wild ones who warned us when the earth sighed."